But a traditional moral orientation, free of hostile tampering, may produce undesirable consequences as well, and not just in the form of circular firing squad sectarianism. Through its focus on ideals and principles rather than results, it may even fail in achieving outcomes that the moral framework would define as good. Altruism toward the homeless can see ever larger encampments, with rampant crime, violence, and drug use, burgeon in major cities about which no one dares do anything, this in turn making life worse for everyone, including the homeless themselves. Overweening pity can preclude a rational recognition of people's actual limitations and misdiagnose their challenges as systemic rather than personal. Misguided compassion can lead to early and repeated release of violent felons, who then proceed to assault innocent victims, time and again. A moral sense can be twisted to accept influxes of millions of illegal aliens, creating a housing crisis, depriving a citizenry of jobs, diluting their vote, diverting resources away from citizens in need, and altering the character of the nation. Furthermore, organizations that steward the moral framework might pursue interests specific to their own survival, but which harm the population in general, such as faith groups who facilitate illegal immigration in order to bolster their membership rolls, not realizing that doing so only empowers leftists who will enact policies harmful to their institutional existence. And on a psychological level, moralism often brings out people's worst tendencies. For many, it becomes a license to bully others through a pose of righteousness. On the left, one sees woke scolds hurling ism slurs at their ideological opponents from a self-appointed politico-moral perch. On the right, one finds homely women chastising attractive rivals for dressing immodestly, when their policing is motivated primarily by envy and resentment. Such base behaviors are enabled by the merit-free manner in which status can be gained in moralistic frameworks. One need hone no particular skill, master no singular abilities to style oneself a moral arbiter. No talent, no proficiency is required. One need merely assert as zealously as possible one's intense belief in the moral code. It is merely a matter of protestation and avowal, requiring no legitimate achievements or accomplishments. This is the background to today's inverted moral hierarchy of professional grievance, of oppression as identity, which incentivizes being performatively offended, in which power and status is gained simply by fashioning one's victimhood and proclaiming it ever more shrilly while extracting endless concessions. An aesthetic rather than moral orientation could foster a more successful opposition to the left or to globalism than attempting to fight on the moral front, which is likely a futile endeavor. Going all in on aesthetics and rejecting moralism as a whole would mean that the successful capture by the left of the moral high ground would lose all of its efficacy. In the words of Kenneth Clark, from his documentary Civilization,
when one begins to ask the question, does it work, instead of asking, is it God's will, one gets a new set of answers.
Or today, in defiance of leftist moralism, one might reword this formulation as,
when one begins to ask the question, does it work, instead of asking, does it foster intersectional equity, one gets a new set of answers.
Many pernicious policies to which a community is vulnerable on a morality basis could be halted on an aesthetico-functional basis simply by asking, does it work? And making the answer the measure of acceptance or rejection of that policy. The mere ability to loudly assert a moral system and craftily promote it would hold no power, as it does today. On aesthetico-functional grounds, morally slippery precepts such as diversity is our strength could be properly judged, and when found wanting, rejected. Degeneracy could be averted as well, and on a sounder basis than a moralistic one. If perversions are opposed on moralistic grounds, then the moral frame being applied can be questioned and possibly undermined. But opposition on the basis of disgust, aesthetics, and a frank assessment of socially harmful consequences, functional, would nullify any circular moralistic appeals which invariably amount to, you must tolerate degeneracy, because not to do so would be intolerant. Even vile behaviors such as street defecation are hard to challenge through traditional moral frameworks with their tendencies toward pathological altruism and universalism. But an aesthetico-functional orientation would not tolerate such practices for a nanosecond, as they would straightforwardly be identified as obscenely disgusting and a health hazard, whereas initiatives such as DEI are currently imposed on moralistic grounds, equity, systemic isms, or various co-options of justice. The opposition to such hostile policies is often likewise based in moralism, equality, color blindness, and as such quickly becomes mired in quibbles over definitions of equality, back and forth, ism, accusations, etc., with each side trying to style themselves as morally superior. But an aesthetico-functional assessment would reject DEI moralism out of hand as having nothing to do with and even hindering optimal performance. With capability and achievement being the only measure, it would avert the competency crisis, favoring assessments based on practical impact alone, no longer hampered by moral blackmail, and by validating beauty as a legitimate consideration when evaluating or shaping public policy, and thus sensibly upgrading the fundamental measure from merely "does it work" to "does it work and yield a beautiful outcome." The results would not only be functional, but also pleasing and uplifting. Some might voice the reservation that beauty is subjective and open to interpretation, but that premise actually identifies another strength of the aesthetic approach, in that it neatly weeds out those with corrupt artistic taste from those whose aesthetic judgment is sound. If someone tries to assert, of a repugnant work of modern art or architecture, that said grotesquerie is beautiful to me, then that person has helpfully outed himself as someone who should be kept away from any position of cultural influence. Given the current state of the culture, a pivot to aestheticism is more worthwhile than ever. While the proselytizing institutions of traditional moralism, the churches, have long diminished in cultural power, the propaganda organs of left political moralism that filled that vacuum, the media, the public schools, the entertainment complex, are likewise beginning to lose their hegemonic grip. Moralism of any kind will always be weaker in the cultural sphere than aestheticism. That's why in the past, Christian movies, for example, found little resonance, the usual criticism against them, that they were too preachy, being entirely sound. Historically, the left was more successful in using the culture to spread its noxious values because it piggybacked its odious messaging onto narrative works that emphasize the aesthetic component. Strong storytelling, interesting characters, gripping visuals. But today, with Hollywood having come out as an unabashed propaganda factory producing overt woke moralism, and with the public increasingly rejecting such bold-faced indoctrination, the right has a unique opportunity to fight on the aesthetic front. Even faith traditions themselves can be assessed aesthetico-functionally to gauge their cultural robustness. Which have resisted leftist infiltration most effectively? Which have succumbed to it? Which foster family formation, which do not? Which oppose cultural rot, which abet it, which produce works of beauty, which generate ugliness? In fact, the best test of any faith, historical or modern, may simply be, does it regard beauty as a blasphemy or a blessing? If the former, then it is a source of pernicious moralism. If the latter, then it is likely to be a wellspring of beneficent moralism. And we need not look far to see examples of aesthetic optimization on the national level, at least in practice, if not as official policy. Consider Japan, perhaps the most enviable nation in the world today in terms of the cultural and social environment that it offers its people. A homogeneous, high-trust society where crime is low, the cities are clean, people behave well, dress neatly, are polite and considerate, yet the infrastructure quality and level of technological advancement is well nigh the highest in the world. What is their secret? In addition to demographic homogeneity and the essential qualities of the Japanese people, their traditional religion, Shintoism, notably does not have a strict moral code or commandments. Rather, it promotes practical values such as harmony, community, sincerity, gratitude, respect, a strong work ethic, purity and cleanliness, awe and reverence, and fosters a sense of shared identity and purpose through various festivals and celebrations. In short, its standards are optimal for making a society work well and in an aesthetically agreeable manner. Per Spengler, vulgarity, not sin, is the antithesis of their ideal. One could hardly conceive of a value set more diametrically opposed to that which we experience in the diverse West today. And this "does it work and does it generate beautiful harmony" approach, in lieu of a good-evil mindset, is no doubt one of the reasons why cultural Marxism has not yet overrun Japan. The nation did not have a ready-made moralistic mold into which the wokest ideology could be poured, no framework that the woke could subvert, no guilt-based sense of original sin that could be exploited, no opportunity to gain status via moral posturing. But we need not even look abroad for examples of nations operating on an implicitly aesthetic orientation. To a greater or lesser degree, such was the case for most of the great European powers, arguably America as well, throughout the latter 19th century and into the 20th. At that time, the dominant faith had already eased into what we might term cultural Christianity, but could more significantly be described as romantic Christianity, in that the faith was appreciated primarily as an artistic wellspring, a national founding myth, one of many, rather than taken as metaphysical literalism. It still provided an afterimage of behavioral norms and did a reasonable job of blocking degeneracy, but in no way hindered scientific nor material advancements. The weakening of Christian prescriptivism did open a vacancy that nascent leftist ideologies, such as socialism and feminism, quickly scrabbled to fill, but also provided an opportunity for romantic nationalism to emerge, which was an entirely favorable development. Nationalism generally tends toward aestheticism and functionality, valorizing the immaterial culture of a nation, both the Christian and folkloric aspects, including ancient myths and legends, yet also pursuing practical material advancement, thus bettering the lives of the nation's citizens, while furnishing them with noble, unifying ideals. It was no contradiction that the secular civic architecture of the time, from government buildings to railway stations, adopted the forms of the intensely Christian Gothic era, decorated them with murals depicting pagan legends from the nation's ancient past, yet equipped them with the most modern communication systems and ultimately electric power. Such best of the best amalgamations of past and present, of the immaterial and the material, are characteristic of societies that elevate aesthetico-functionalism over moralism. And had we continued in this vein, rather than allowing malicious parties to exploit our vulnerabilities and hijack our culture, there is no telling how much richer the world would be today, both culturally and technologically. The City Beautiful movement was just one of the rich fruits of the aesthetic worldview that prevailed in the West till the First World War. Subsequently, however, our does it work approach was slowly but steadily supplanted by interminable is it good struggle sessions, while the hostile forces that marched through our institutions maliciously redefined good as any social developments that marginalized and subjugated the majority population, and evil as anything that hindered that agenda. This is one of the existential issues that faces the West today. Do we continue to submit ourselves to judgments based on a good-evil moral scheme in which the definitions of good and evil are entirely set by our opponents, and in which the spectrum of what is termed good ranges from actively abetting our own disenfranchisement to passively accepting our elimination, even as our cities and nations are reduced to third-world conditions? Or do we reject weaponized moral framings altogether, and instead straightforwardly and sensibly adopt an aesthetico-functional worldview where does it work? And more to the point, does it work and yield a beautiful outcome is the metric that we follow. If we do, then instead of sentencing ourselves to life in increasingly dystopian hellscapes, we might yet be able to pursue goals such as the City Beautiful and the Nation Beautiful, for ourselves and our posterity.